How are things now? My name is Paddy, and welcome to the 13th episode of my podcast, Finding Cashflow. This episode is going to be on the supply side of oil. Originally, this episode was meant to be on private credit, and we'll still absolutely be doing an episode on private credit because that's a very important market to understand. And I think private credit is something that'll be in our financial news a whole lot more by the end of the year than it is now. But the massive supply shock that our global oil market is going through is something that I think is far more timely, as well as being something which I believe is still grossly misunderstood by the markets. The reason that this oil shock is so substantial is because 20 million barrels of oil use flow out through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That's 20% or 1/5 of the total oil supply in the world. That's the same amount of oil that the US economy consumes every day. The US economy consumes around 20 million barrels of oil every day, and now that's the amount of oil that has been taken off the global oil market. And the reason that this is so substantial is because the price of oil or the price of any asset or commodity is set by the interaction of supply and demand. In episode 2 of this podcast, we looked at the supply of new homes in Canada in future years. And we did this in order to try and predict where future prices might go. So in episode 2, we looked at the supply of new homes in Canada over the coming years. And in episode 6 of this podcast, we tried to determine where future demand might go. And then by looking at the interaction of future supply and future demand, we concluded that home prices would continue to come down in Canada, with average home prices across all of Canada now down over 20% from the peak, and I believe that they have quite a ways further to go. And just like I thought that the elevated supply of new homes in Canada would be a big factor in driving home prices down in Canada, I believe that the massive oil shock that we're currently living through right now in the world will drive oil prices far higher in the coming weeks and months. So let's now look at the cause of this supply shock, which is the war in Iran and the subsequent closure of the Strait of Hormuz. We're now in day 69 of the war in Iran, a war which started on February 28. But before we look at how this war has unfolded thus far, let's first go back to the day before the war, on February 27th. At this time, the US and Iran were in active negotiations in Oman, and the Omani foreign minister said that a breakthrough was within reach. He had stated that Iran had agreed to end their uranium stockpiling. But on February 28, the US attacked Iran anyway, and the first 3 days of this war saw the highest density of strikes in military history, with hundreds of Iranian schools and hospitals being targeted and obliterated. And then the Iranians responded immediately, and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, closed the Strait of Hormuz, which I think was perfectly foreseeable. In fact, I would go as far as saying that it is completely evident that the Iranians had been preparing for such an attack for decades now. And with a tremendously inferior military, the Iranians understood that they didn't have many cards to play, but they fully understood that the one and maybe the only trump card that they had to play was the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Here is a map of Iran and the Gulf nations, showing the Strait of Hormuz. It is through this narrow body of water that 20% of the world's oil supply passes through each day, or did pass through before the US launched this war in Iran. And the Strait of Hormuz has essentially been completely closed for 2 months now. And I am certain, due to the lag effect between oil being transported out of the Persian Gulf to refined oil finally being consumed, that we absolutely have not seen the full impact of this 2-month closure just yet. Also, I believe from the start of this war that it would be hard to open the Strait of Hormuz without US boots on the ground in Iran, as I believe that the IRGC had and still have substantial advantages over the US in this war. This is due to the Iranians utilizing asymmetric warfare. Asymmetric warfare is like 1,000 mosquitoes attacking a man who is armed with a knife and a sniper. The man is far stronger than the mosquitoes, and the man has weapons that would make him lethal in a fight against many other unarmed men or men with inferior weapons. However, in this hypothetical example, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the 1,000 mosquitoes came out on top in this fight. So let's now look at the asymmetric warfare between the US and Iran, and specifically in the Strait of Hormuz. The US now has 15,000 troops in the region, and 2 of their nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS George H.W. Bush. There was a 3rd aircraft carrier in the region up until recently, the USS Gerald R. Ford, which is now headed back to the US for repairs and maintenance. These aircraft carriers house many different types of planes, including the F-35 fighter jets. And because the US have far superior aircraft to the Iranians, the Americans now absolutely have air superiority in the region. The US military also has around a dozen of their missile destroyers in the region, some of which were being used to support the short-lived Project Freedom earlier this week. So the Iranian military, or the IRGC, have absolutely no chance whatsoever taking on the US military. However, this is asymmetrical warfare, and the IRGC aren't just targeting US military forces. They're targeting oil tankers and commercial ships in the region in order to close the Strait of Hormuz. And so far, this is something that they've proved to be very successful at doing. The Iranians have their fleet of fast attack boats, or the Mosquito fleet as the US has been calling them. And we can see the lads sitting on top of the boat with a bazooka. And remember, the IRGC are going after oil tankers and commercial vessels, not the US military. And the long southern coastline of Iran is very mountainous, in contrast with the flat plains of the Gulf nations to the west and south of the Persian Gulf. And these speedboats are hidden in sea caves along the jagged Iranian coastline. Iran also has one of the largest and most diverse libraries of anti-tank guided missiles in the world. The more advanced of these weapons can target an oil tanker from up to 8 kilometers away, and these weapons can be fired from anywhere along the Iranian coastline. These weapons could also be fired from the attack speedboats. However, the instability of a small boat makes guiding the missile after the missile has been fired more difficult. One of the ways these missiles can be guided is by the user of this weapon continuing to point a laser at the target. The missile, which has then already left the weapon or has been fired, will continue to track the laser beam until it hits its target, or misses. But as long as the laser is still pointed at the tanker, the chances that the missile will hit the tanker is extremely likely. In order to easily control the boats that are passing through the Strait of Hormuz, the IRGC has mined the southern end of the strait. This is where the normal shipping lanes used to be. Mining this area forced the ships to have to sail up close to Larak Island on the north. This enabled the IRGC to closely monitor the ships that were passing, as well as easily being able to threaten any ships that they didn't want to pass. The Iranians also have massive quantities of Shahed drones. These are the drones that Iran donated to Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine, and these drones can literally be launched from the back of a pickup truck. And once again, the mountains along the coastline of southern Iran provide the ideal hiding places in land caves and sea caves where these attack boats, anti-tank guided missiles and drones can be hidden, stored and launched from. So this is once again a great example of asymmetrical warfare, where the Iranians aren't just targeting US military forces, but they're targeting large and slow-moving oil tankers and cargo ships. And where the US must protect all ships in order to keep the strait open, the Iranians only need to target 1 or 2 ships in order to completely close the strait, and we've seen this to be the case already. And if the IRGC were to suffer massive losses to the point that the regime was near defeat, I think one of the last things that they may do may be to litter the strait with these mines. And as these mines can be deployed from small and inconspicuous fishing boats, I think it would be almost impossible to stop the Iranians from doing this. Also, these more modern sea mines float beneath the water, making them much harder to find. And they detect sound and movement and even detect changes in pressure as well as magnetic fields in the water when these larger ships are passing by, and they will then detonate when they believe a ship is close. And then on April 13th, the US put their blockade in place, and I have to say that I absolutely did not see this coming. The US, in an attempt to open the Strait of Hormuz, created an additional blockade, and this does for sure put huge pressure on the Iranian economy. But the IRGC are willing to sacrifice their lives for the survival of their regime. I doubt very much that economic pressure is going to work. And it is worth noting the location of the US blockade, well out into the Gulf of Oman. And I had believed from the start of this blockade that this was proof that the Americans are very cautious about entering the strait, as the US military are very focused on not suffering casualties if at all possible. On the other hand, the IRGC is defined by a doctrine that prioritizes the survival of the clerical system, the survival of the regime, over the survival of any of its individual members. Dying for the regime means martyrdom. It is something that their fighters are more than willing to do. This, once again, is an example of asymmetrical warfare, where the Iranians are playing by different rules and value victory over avoiding death. So let's now look at the US and Iran's current positions, because it's very important to understand the positions and perspectives of both sides. So firstly, what do the Americans want? Well, originally this was to be a mission of liberation. They killed the Iranian supreme leader on day 1 of the war, and Trump urged the Iranian civilians to go out onto the streets and take back their country. But I don't think that Trump ever cared too much about the Iranian people, because if he did, he probably wouldn't post rhetoric such as bombing the country back into the Stone Ages. Then it was the annihilation of Iran's nuclear capabilities, even though Trump had claimed that the Americans had achieved this last year. But the Iranians have been completely unwilling to give this up. They view enriched uranium as a sacred national asset, and they see it as being necessary for their survival to deter other countries from attacking them. And I guarantee that they would feel even more strongly about this now, ever since the US and Israelis attacked them. Now, what the US is most focused on is opening up the Strait of Hormuz. Essentially, back to the way it was before the war started, which would be like a dream at this stage. And the US needs to achieve this quickly. And this is because of the massive negative implications that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is about to have on our global economy. An economic shock that I think the markets are still completely underestimating. Speaking of the misunderstandings of the markets, here is the market reaction to Trump calling off Project Freedom. Trump tried to save face by saying he was halting Project Freedom as a sign of goodwill, so that diplomacy could prevail. But this didn't make any sense at all. Why would Trump halt such a large military operation only 2 days after they'd launched it, when he had just been boasting about how impactful the mission would be? The reason he halted the operation is clear. It is because Project Freedom only escorted 2 ships through the Strait of Hormuz in the 2 days of its operation. Trump decided to cancel the mission before it could be deemed to be a failure. But the markets believed him anyway, as they normally do. The markets are always over-eager to believe any news that would drive the markets higher. And here is what happened in the oil markets the same day. I've always believed the markets lack the ability to think rationally. But ever since the start of this war, I've lost all faith in the market's rationale. So let's now look at what the Iranians want. And the Iranians made this very clear last weekend when they put forth a 14-point proposal. Firstly, they're looking for an end to the war in Lebanon. But I'm not quite sure that Israel will comply with this, because it's not consistent with the Zionist vision for a greater Israel. If you're unfamiliar with the Zionist vision for a greater Israel, I'd very strongly recommend that you do some research on that. In fact, the IDF have only been increasing their military operations in Lebanon over the last few days. And by military operations, I mean the displacing and killing of thousands of women and children, just like they've done in Gaza. And if you'd like to see what the Israelis have done in Gaza over the last 2.5 years, I'd recommend going on to Google Maps and zooming in on Gaza. And then you can look up places like cafes and restaurants and go through the pictures and videos. One of the last videos I saw was a woman playing a piano in a cafe as other women and children and families went about their day. And now, this is Gaza. Iran want firm international guarantees that the US and Israelis won't launch future attacks on them. But how will the Iranians trust the US again? They were in negotiations with the US when the US started this war. The Iranians also want the removal of US military bases from the region around Iran. It was from these bases that the US launched this war. But I don't think the US will be willing to agree to this. The Iranians are also looking for the release of billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets, as well as payment of war reparations for damages incurred during the war, as well as the lifting of sanctions. All things that I think the US will be very slow to agree to. And instead of simply reopening the Strait of Hormuz under its old terms, Iran now wants a new governing system for the Strait of Hormuz. And there's no mention of their nuclear capabilities whatsoever. Iran views its nuclear program as a sacred national asset, vital for the survival of their regime, to deter other countries from attacking them. Iran have stated that enriched uranium is as sacred as the Iranian soil. So, in summary, the US and Iran have completely opposing demands. Iran's long-term goal is to have enriched uranium. They view this as necessary for national security, for the survival of their regime. And this is very understandable, once again, as they were in negotiations at the time that the US attacked them. But Iran don't have nuclear capabilities just yet in order to deter the US. But what they fully understand is that their control over the Strait of Hormuz and their ability to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed is currently the largest leverage that they have over the US. And I'll repeat what I said to friends at the very beginning of this war. It'll be hard to open the Strait of Hormuz without US troops on the ground. So, where does this leave us? Well, it means that the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and it will continue to be very difficult to open. And why is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz so important for a global economy? Well, it's because 20% of the world's oil supply use flow out through the Strait of Hormuz, around 20 million barrels per day, making it the world's most critical maritime energy choke point. 20% of the world's LNG also flowed out through the strait, liquefied natural gas. There are tens of millions of families in Southeast Asia which are dependent on natural gas in order to feed their families. One of the most cherished possessions of poorer families across Southeast Asia is a small gas canister that they use every day to cook rice. This is necessary for feeding their family because you can't eat raw rice. 30% of the world's fertilizer also came out through the Strait of Hormuz. An interesting fact about fertilizer is that we've over 8 billion people in the world currently. But it is estimated that we might be able to only support half of that, over 4 billion people, without the use of fertilizer. In other words, there are 4 billion people in the world right now that might perish and starve without availability of fertilizer. 30% of the world's helium also comes through the strait. And helium is necessary for the production of semiconductors. And this helium went to countries like South Korea and Taiwan, to countries like Taiwan Semiconductor. Taiwan Semiconductor is the world's largest dedicated independent semiconductor foundry, commanding over 70% of the global contract chip-making market. Despite this is TSMC's stock performance year to date. Investors in TSMC are clearly not at all concerned about this supply shock. Also, its stock is up over 140% in the past 1 year, which is just astonishing growth. And from looking into the portfolios of the most popular mutual funds and ETFs being offered by the main asset management firms and brokerages out there, I can tell you with certainty that Taiwan Semiconductor is a very heavily owned stock. And once again, why is all this information about supply so important? Well, it's because the price of any asset or commodity is set by the interaction of supply and demand. And we've seen higher oil prices already, but I worry that the price of oil is going even higher and will stay higher for longer. And I want everyone to understand who's mainly at fault for this, because it would be very easy to forget or to simply not know. Irish farmers were out protesting on the streets a number of weeks back about the cost of diesel. Essentially what they were protesting about is they were protesting the high level of government taxes on fuel in Ireland. And I'm absolutely not going to argue with this whatsoever, but I would like everybody to understand who's mainly at fault for these higher fuel prices. I was talking to a friend at home in Ireland a number of weeks back, and this is a man who'd easily put up 100 hours a week on a tractor burning a lot of diesel, something that both him and I used to together as kids when we were younger. And this friend is a Trump supporter. And I wanted this friend to clearly understand that it is Trump that is at fault for these higher fuel prices, and it is Trump who will be responsible for the higher fuel prices that we'll see from here. Because once again, I believe that fuel prices are going higher, and I don't think the Irish government will be able to cut taxes enough to counteract this. And as I said in my last video a number of weeks back when we looked at the carry trade, I really wish I'd done an episode sooner on the impacts of this war, because I'm still fully convinced that the markets are grossly misunderstanding the impacts of this war and where oil prices will go from here, as well as the prices of other very important commodities in our economy. And the S&P 500 is once again at all-time highs, flirting with 7,400 today, Friday the 8th of May, substantially higher than where they were at the beginning of the war. But despite markets being at all-time highs, I'm still extremely concerned about US equities. And this is due to my study of past technology bubbles, and I'm still fully convinced that we're in the midst of an AI bubble. Together with my belief that I believe we're nearing the end of a short-term debt cycle, as described by Ray Dalio. This debt cycle or credit cycle is something that Ray has observed from researching 500 years of Western empires as well as 2,000 years of Chinese dynasties. And this credit cycle fits in perfectly well with this chart here, which is a chart that I've used ever since the start of this podcast to describe where I believe we are in this credit cycle. Ray Dalio would say that it is the increasing of borrowing costs or interest rates that marks the beginning of the end of a short-term debt cycle. And then once we come through a rate hiking cycle, that is historically where we've experienced a recession. And then once we experience a recession, rates are lowered and we can begin our next short-term debt cycle. And then there's the main reason I started this podcast, to talk about my true passion, which is Canadian real estate. Because I've believed for years now that I've had insight that almost no one else has or had. Insight that I think has escaped the attention of our banks based on the reporting from the banks as well as people that I know who work in very high positions in these banks. Insight that I also believe has escaped the attention of the mainstream media, even though the mainstream media were often asking the right questions, but I always believe that they weren't getting the right answers, or certainly not the answers that I would have had for them. And I believe it's information that has escaped the most prominent real estate podcasters in Canada. And this is because everybody is simply examining and reporting what has already happened, rather than examining what is likely to happen in the future. And I learned this 2 years ago on a call with Ron Butler from the Angry Mortgage podcast. Ron was in Parliament recently and he spoke as a witness for the Standing Committee on Finance. And I was listening to one of Ron's episodes, one of his podcasts about 2 years ago, and Ron was stating that the negative cash flow of one-bed apartments was in the realm of minus $300 to minus $600 a month. And he and his guests were talking about how manageable this negative cash flow would be for the owners of these units. But I had calculated that the cash flow of these pre-construction condos upon completion would be in the realm of minus $1,000 to minus $1,500 a month. So I ran home from the gym and I called Ron's office, and after getting stopped by the receptionist the first 4 times, eventually they put me through to Ron, and I told Ron about where this negative cash flow was going. And then Ron asked what inputs I was using in order to calculate this, and I told Ron that I was using the average price per square foot of a pre-construction one-bed apartment that is being sold here in the Lower Mainland, which was $1,400 per square foot. Ron said that he didn't know that the price had gotten this high, and he asked me how I knew this to be true. And I said to Ron that what I've done is I've driven around to all of these presentation centres all around the Lower Mainland. I've met with all these realtors and they've physically handed me a piece of paper with this pricing. You know, oftentimes they wouldn't give this pricing out over the phone. You had to drive to these presentation centres. Oftentimes they'd ask me to make an appointment, even from 24 and 25 and even in 2023, I was the only person in these presentation centres. There was no need to make an appointment. So Ron simply couldn't refute the data that I had, and he has since in his podcast corrected himself on where this negative cash flow is. But when Ron realised that I was calculating the cash flow of condos that hadn't come to completion yet, in fact, they were years away from completion, he said, and in this tone, he said, "Oh, you're looking at the future." And I just went silent. I was dumbfounded in all honesty. I thought that's what we were all doing. I thought we were all looking at the future. I also spoke to Ron about how I thought rents would be falling substantially, with a combination of record high supply as well as our declining population. Ron didn't believe that our population in Canada could decline. He said that may have happened in Ireland after 2008, but that's not going to happen in Canada. And once again, I was dumbfounded because our government had already announced their plans to reduce the amount of non-PR residents from 7% to 5%. They made this announcement in April of 2024. But Ron and other mainstream real estate podcasters have just started talking about our negative population growth in the last 6 months or so, as if it's new news. They're reporting on it now because it has started to happen now. But once again, the government announced that 2 years ago. And like I said in this podcast previously, I believed them when they announced that because they were talking about something within their control, something that they could do. Unlike when they said that they were going to double the amount of housing completions over the next few years. I didn't listen to them then at all because they're talking about something that they simply could not do. But the main thing I wanted to focus on with Ron was the huge glut of unsold pre-construction units that were still under construction. This is where the real issue lies. So here is my update on the newly completed and unsold condos in Vancouver. There was 124 pre-construction condos sold in Vancouver in Q1 of this year. That's down from 6,000 in the first quarter of 2021. That's a 98% decline. And we are at a 95% decline from the 10-year average. And it is said that there could be more than 5,000 newly completed and unsold condos on the market now. And we saw this coming. We spoke about this in episode 2, and we looked into it a whole lot more detail in episode 6 when we spoke about the amount of unsold units that were still under construction. They weren't so much a problem when they were still under construction, but now they're a real problem now that these units have come to completion. And there's thousands more unsold units under construction that will be coming to completion. And who's going to buy these units? They're priced about 40 or 50% above other new units that are on the resale market. And they're all heavily cash flow negative. The resale market units are cash flow negative. These pre-construction units are grossly cash flow negative. And all of this unsold inventory is currently sitting on the developers' balance sheets. And because of this, I think some of the largest developers in our main cities of Vancouver and Toronto are going to be going bankrupt and going out of business. The last thing I told Ron that I did was that I graphed out the unit starts and unit completions in Canada going back to the mid-1950s. And then from looking at these graphs, it was evident, as one would expect, that one data series followed the other. Completions followed starts. And this is quite obvious because all houses and all units are started before they're completed. I then took the start data and the completion data from 2010 to 2020, and I created an algorithm which turned the start data into the completion data. It was fairly straightforward, really. I simply applied a time to completion to each housing unit type. I then played around with these construction timelines until I got the algorithm to accurately turn the start data from 2010 to 2020 into the completion data for that same time period. I then applied this algorithm to the start data from 2020 onwards. And this then suggested to me that we were going to break our all-time record for housing unit completions in Canada in 2025. But that's not official StatsCan data yet, and I can't claim to be correct about that just yet. But I was saying this at a time where the only narrative out there was that we simply couldn't build homes quickly enough, even though the data was showing us that we were building more homes than we ever were before. And from doing this analysis, I learned that even trends in housing starts and completions are linked to interest rates. Everything in our economy is linked to interest rates. And I could easily see that times of record housing starts always happen during times of market exuberance. And they were always followed by market corrections and subsequent substantial decline in housing starts. The patterns were becoming clear. And by understanding the patterns of the past, I was able to far more clearly see what was happening in our present-day market. I also believe that 2026 will be a record year of completions here in Canada. But enough about my predictions about things that may have already happened. I want to focus on my predictions for the future. So here they are. I believe that we're still in the midst of an equity market bubble, which has been driven by new technology, AI. And combined with the fact that I believe we're nearing the end of a short-term debt cycle, I think the S&P 500 could have a substantial correction in excess of 40%. And this time, I don't think the recovery will be quick. And then regarding Canadian housing, the Canadian HPI Home Price Index is already down by over 20% from the peak. And unlike Ron and other prominent guests that he has had on his show earlier this year, such as Steve Serezzi and Ben Rabideau, I believe that there may be much further for these price declines to go. Ben seemed skeptical about this when I spoke with him on the phone earlier this year. But I said to Ben that prices always go down more after the recession has started, and we're not at that stage in the business cycle just yet. I also said that I believe there could be a substantial correction in US equities, and if this were to happen, that it would have such an effect on Canadians that there would be spillover effects into the Canadian housing market, which would cause prices to go down further. And I believe that Canadian average home prices will be down by over 33% from the peak by the time all is said and done. And if the S&P 500 doesn't correct by 40%, and if the Canadian average home price doesn't come down by over 33% from the peak, I'm going to stop making these videos. Because unlike other YouTubers or the majority of YouTubers, I'm not simply here to make content. I'm not here to sell you anything or to ask you to pay me money for anything. I'm simply here because I strongly believe that I've got valuable information on the two most important financial markets to Canadians, which is the Canadian housing market as well as US equity markets. Finally, I believe that oil prices will go higher from here, even if the Strait of Hormuz was to open tomorrow. But unfortunately, I don't believe that oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz are going to go back to pre-war levels anytime soon. So, if you'd like to find out if I was onto something substantial or a number of substantial things, or if I was simply full of shite, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you all again soon, hopefully.